Hi, everybody. All right, so today we're going to talk about American art. American art, while it has its foundations from the early times, early colonial times, American art really begins to develop in the late 18th century. The late 1700s is when American painting really starts to take off. It becomes its own entity in the mid 19th century, around the 1850s, and then it becomes its totally own unique form after the Civil War. We're going to go over those three different eras in this video. So here we go. We're going to start off with early American art. Uh, the very first prominent American painters weren't American at all. They were actually English. Uh, the first most famous American painter would have been somebody that painted this, an artist by the name of Benjamin West. Here you have a depiction of the death of General Wolfe. Uh, General Wolfe was a British commander in the French Indian War in the mid 18th century. Benjamin West, though he was born in Pennsylvania in America, uh, he did his technical art training in Europe and then spent the rest of his days in England painting for, among other people, the royal court. So he, even though he was born in America, he was very much a British subject. This painting, The Death of General Wolfe, painted in 1770, was sort of British propaganda. Um, while this looks like it certainly could fit in the Romantic era, and it certainly has romantic qualities to it, strong romantic qualities to it, it was sort of a revolutionary painting for the time because instead of depicting soldiers, which was a common subject matter for Romantic art, instead of depicting the soldier in glorious triumph, here you have a dying uh, general after he has suffered a wound in a battle. And rather than being depicted as Greek or Roman deities with traditional classical uh, symbolism surrounding the general, here you just have the general wearing regular clothes of the day. Now, whether or not that's actually the garb that they would have worn in the battle is another question, but it's traditional, typical clothing for the day, which was revolutionary for the time. So this painting certainly would have stood out when it was painted. You'll also notice the figures surrounding him are representing different ethnicities and tribes of the Americas, as if to say everybody is united together under the British crown. Again, British propaganda. So Benjamin West is considered to be the first true American painter, though his subject matter and his cultural preferences were very much British. A very iconic painting, which you all would be familiar with, probably are familiar with, is Washington crossing the Delaware. This is painted in the 1850s, so almost 100 years later, 80 years after Benjamin West paints The Death of General Wolfe. This painting occurs, and it's painted by Emanuel Lutz. He was a German immigrant, studied and grew up in Germany, but came over to America as an immigrant and made his professional career in the United States as a professional painter. I want to show you this compared to The Death of General Wolfe. This is also very much the Romantic era, um, but rather than depicting a general dying, this is very much high Romantic painting, mimicking a lot of the French Romantic paintings that would have been done a generation prior. So, very famous painting done 1850 by Emanuel Lutz. This is a painting by Walt Disney. He painted this during a really boring art history lecture in the mid 20th century. Uh, On to portraiture. So, most of early American paintings are actually portraits. Here are two examples of them. The one on the left is a boy with a flying squirrel, which is just a great name for a painting. It's painted by the most famous and well-regarded portrait artist of the early American art movement, a guy by the name of John Singleton Copley, or Copley. You can say either or. Uh, Here I have this painting because it's so unique. A lot of his portraiture would have been of wealthy landowners and businessmen in New England and the eastern colonies. Um, but here you have this boy with a flying squirrel. It is an odd subject matter, an odd painting, beautifully done. It was for the enjoyment of Europeans. I'm sorry. My son is screaming in the background, so I'm a little distracted. Let me get focused here again. Okay. John Singleton Copley was a British subject as well, much like Benjamin West. Um, but he, unlike West, spent most of his lifetime painting American colonists in America. So this is painted in 1765. On the right, far more popular, more recognizable, George Washington. This is painted by the other, probably most preeminent portrait artist, Gilbert Stuart. Gilbert Stuart was very famous because he was the propaganda machine of the early American uh, uh, colonies. So he painted all of the founding fathers. He did it out of his love for the birth of the United States of America. He also did it because it was a great way to make money. It was very popular and desired to have portraits of the founding fathers. So he made a lot of different portraits of them, and they're still along the East Coast still today. A lot of these early American portrait artists were inspired by a sort of Greco-Roman revival style. Uh, yeah, so we're gonna move on here. I just want you guys to know that a lot of early American art was mostly portraiture. It was mostly portraiture because that is what sold. That is what made money. People wanted portraits done of themselves. It was also a good way for propaganda. The first truly American style of painting is known as the Hudson River School. You got to know that. The Hudson River School was the first the first paintings that people thought, gosh, that is truly an American painting. All the other paintings before that, you could have imagined it as being French Romantic or English Romantic or as German Romantic, but the Hudson River School is purely American. The Hudson River School follows a style of painting known as regionalism. Hudson River School painting is all about landscapes, majestic, overwhelming, transcendent landscapes. This one is called the Oxbow. The Oxbow is done by one of the most famous Hudson River School painters, Thomas Cole. This is done in the 1830s. This is a painting of a storm coming over the Connecticut River. So this would have been the Connecticut River Valley. Connecticut River flows through Connecticut, but it also divides Vermont and New Hampshire. This painting is relatively big. As you can see, it is really, because of the lighting, it feels very warm and inviting, but it's also treacherous and scary with the impending storms coming in from the left, which is very much how people would have understood the American landscape, as inviting and nourishing and fruitful, but also as terrifying and powerful and scary. This is very much a transcendent painting in that it depicts the power and awesomeness of God and God's creation, much like German Romanticism would have done. Another common artist from the Hudson River School is a guy by the name of Frederick Church. He's also one of the most preeminent Hudson River School painters. Frederick Church painted, among other things, this. This is called Niagara. This is Niagara Falls. This painting, again, depicts the power and awesomeness of nature. You can see, obviously, you pay attention to this powerful collapsing waterfall, but if you look carefully, and you can begin to notice on the left side a beautiful, very subtle rainbow appearing, as if to suggest, amidst all this power and destruction comes beauty and goodness and hope. This painting is significant because it was one of the first and most heavily replicated paintings of early American art. Uh, this was replicated and sent all across the world. This painting traveled from one gallery to the next, both in America and throughout the world. Lastly, the last Hudson River School style painting I want to show you is this. This is called Rocky Mountains, Lander's Peak. It is painted by Albert Bierstadt. Albert Bierstadt, he was a little bit later than Church and Thomas Cole. He painted up until the Civil War, so 1850s into the early 1860s. This is painted in 1859. This painting in real life is humongous. It's 6 foot tall and 10 foot wide. Here you have a depiction of the Rocky Mountains in the background. In the middle ground, you have this beautiful waterfall. And then in the foreground, you have this meeting of Native Americans. Albert Bierstadt made his money by romanticizing and publicizing the greatest scenes of the American West. So he spent most of his adult life traveling across the American West, the Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas, the Yosemite Valley. And he took drawings and sketches and watercolors of these places and then came back to his studios in the East Coast and would paint these enormous paintings and would display them all across galleries in the American East, displaying the beauty and power of lands in the West that photography at that point hadn't even captured yet. That brings us up to the Civil War. There's sort of a break, a shift in American art during the Civil War. You have, before the Civil War, you have the strong romanticism, the celebration of the American continent, the American landscape. And then after the Civil War, you have a much stronger focus on human beings and human relationships, political dynamics in this emerging nation. The subject of the artwork is mimicking the growth of a nation, of its political nuances and its economic diversity. Here are two paintings by one of the most famous painters after the Civil War, Thomas Eakins. Eakins is spelled with an E, E-A-K-I-N-S, so it looks like Eakins, but it's pronounced Eakins. He studied in Philadelphia, and he spent his life teaching and painting in Philadelphia, which is where Philadelphia was pretty much the epicenter of art for American painters. All the great American painters until the early 20th century lived and worked in Philadelphia. These are two paintings of anatomy clinics. The one on the left is called the Gross Clinic, after Dr. Gross, who is the doctor highlighted in the left. And on the right, you have the Agnew Clinic. The one on the left is painted in the 1870s. The one in the right, early 1890s, late 1880s. Both of these are anatomy clinics where you have your medical students looking in the background and the operations in the foregrounds with bright light. If you notice, both of them are very warm paintings. This is traditional American style painting. You're going to have this rich glow paint. It's called burnt sienna. It looks like rust color. Underneath, you paint everything with this burnt sienna color, and then you apply other paints on top of that. So you have this very warm, vibrant feel. This is very common in American painting. Thomas Eakins is probably known best in art history for being one of the first famous painters to be using photographs. He was worried about anatomical perfection and correctness. He's really getting into the nitty-gritty of what makes human beings anatomically, and also maybe spiritually, or what's in the soul of a human person. So both of these paintings are very biologically minded on the surface, but they're also paintings that get us to wonder, what does it mean to be a person in an emerging modern era? What makes us humans? These are great philosophical questions, and in these paintings, they're also the subject, those questions are the subject of these two paintings. What makes us us? Along with Thomas Eakins, just a little bit after him, you have another very, very famous American painter, Winslow Homer. Uh, I'm sorry. This is not Winslow Homer. This is also Thomas Eakins. I got ahead of myself. Thomas Eakins, in addition to doing these beautifully anatomically perfected paintings, would also do really spiritual, soulful paintings. We prayed with this today at the beginning of our lesson here, but I just want to show you the study for um, the dancing lesson and then the actual final painting on the right. Again, what makes us us? It's not just our bodies, it's also our souls, our relationships, our ability to create meaning and beauty out of everyday things. One of the things I love about Thomas Eakins, particularly his unfinished pieces, and he has a lot of unfinished and loose style paintings, is that they feel like they are emerging. You can feel the artistic process in his designs. It's one of the reasons personally why I love his work as a professional artist. But also, I think he's a great spiritual painter in that he crafts a being. You can see a being beginning to emerge, a work of art beginning to emerge, rather than just seeing some finished product. It's a really beautiful, beautiful sentiment that you see in the realist style in America. These are paintings by Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer became very prominent after the Civil War. This painting on the left is a veteran in a new field. Here he is harvesting, you have a man harvesting wheat. If you look very closely, you can't see it too well, but right here is a military jacket that he would have worn in his field of battle in the Civil War. He takes that off. He goes back to his job, which rather than harvesting men and wounding and killing men in battle, he is now harvesting wheat to nourish a hungry country. It's a very, if you just look at it on surface level, it's a very nostalgic, beautiful painting. But in all of Winslow's Homer's pieces, however nostalgic or nice it might be, it also has a really dark undertone. He's known for having these nostalgic paintings, but every nostalgic painting has some kind of richer, darker, more profound meaning to it. Towards the end of his career, he got really into watercolors, such as these two. He spent most of his time working in Massachusetts in the Boston area, and he had a lot of watercolor scenes of hunting expeditions. Here you have a hunting dog and you have a buck escaping by swimming away. Towards the end of his life, he got looser, more abstracted, less about creating perfect forms, and more worried, like most modernists, about conveying an experience, a particular emotion in a scene. Here you have the Sponge Diver. These are both painted in the late 19th century, like the 1890s, around there. The Sponge Diver, at the end of his life, he spent most of his days in Bermuda, painting a lot of different scenes on the Bermuda Islands. Here you have an African American reaching up into a ship. This looks like just a nice painting, but it also has deep, rich uh, political statements to it. You have the beginning of Jim Crow after the Civil War. Here you have this African American reaching, struggling to get into the ship, bringing his goods with them. This is a subversive uh, painting, implicit against uh, all of the racism still happening in America in the late 19th century. A contemporary of Homer and Akins would have been an artist by the name of Henry Osawa Turner. He studied in Philadelphia, much like Akins did. He was an African American. He's known as probably the most famous uh, early African American artist. Henry Turner, I'm sorry, Henry Osawa Tanner. Tanner depicted a lot of religious scenes. He was the son of a Methodist minister. He studied in a seminary, uh, mostly literature in his Protestant seminary. He eventually became a painter and studied in Paris, France, where as a black man he was free to uh, associate with and interact in the painting salons of Europe. Still in America, even though the Civil War had been over, it was still very segregated, so he wasn't able to start off his career in America. Eventually, he gained enough notoriety where he came back to the United States and kept painting. Uh, on the left, you have what's called The Thankful Poor, a very, very famous painting painted in the 1890s. On the right, you have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, painted in the 1930s towards the end of his career. You can see, much like Winslow Homer, his pieces become more abstract, uh, more less about perfection of forms and more about expression of color and feeling. Within the American realist school, you have emerging sentiments towards modernism, and you also have this other school called the Ashcan School. The Ashcan School refers to ash cans that were common in American urban settings. So, the late 19th century, you have the rise of the urban landscape in America, um, in which you have large swaths of uh, underemployed or underfunded working poor. The Ashcan painters focused on that class struggle between the rich and the overwhelming population of any urban city, which would have been the working poor. On the left, you have a painting by George Bellows. Here you have, he painted, among other things, a lot of people fighting. These were always considered to be implicitly political struggles. In this case, you have a racial struggle, uh, white versus black. On the right, you have a painting by Robert Enri, who we read The Art Spirit. He painted this painting on the right. Uh, you have this very snowy, idyllic landscape, which otherwise would have been really, really oppressive and gruesome and somewhat ugly. But he put some snow in there and gives it a sort of romantic feel. Uh, both of these paintings are heavy applications of paint, very fluid brush marks. You can imagine the painter uh, interacting with and being passionate about his work. You can see the hand of the painter in both of these paintings, as if he's not cool and collected, but passionate and ready to fight, ready to share with you his message and his belief. Quintessentially modernist paintings. The last artist I want to talk to you about here, and we're skipping over all sorts of other artists, but the last one I want to talk to you is this guy right here. The one on the painting on the left is called Nighthawks. Uh, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. What's his name? Oh, it's been a long day, everybody. Gosh, I can't think of it. Oh man. Okay. So Nighthawks. It'll come to me. Nighthawks. No, I'm gonna Google it on the side here. Just wait. Do something else with your life for just a second here. I'm so sorry. I've worked so long on this video. I don't want to. start over again because we're this far along. Edward Hopper. Gosh, I knew that. Okay, Edward Hopper. Also, Philadelphia trained painter. Nighthawks here in this painting on the right. I can't remember the title of it either. Both of these paintings convey a sort of urban loneliness. Urban loneliness. In the modern era, a lot of times people talk about being lonely. This is not a new idea. Edward Hopper, this sort of melancholic, recluse painter who spent a lot of his time by himself, oftentimes over and over again in his painting depicted really beautiful scenes, really well designed, proportioned scenes with these isolated characters. So people love his style of painting. People think his paintings are really beautiful, and they are, but they're also really lonely and frankly kind of sad. Because if you look at these two paintings in particular, nobody looks at anybody else. There's not a whole lot there's minimal human interaction, and what interaction you do see doesn't seem very warm, which is kind of how he felt with his life. And I think a lot of times people today, especially in this quarantine time, but even before that, could feel lonely. So his work really speaks to a lot of people, sometimes for the wrong reasons because they don't know what they're looking at. But nevertheless, for those people that struggle with loneliness or depression, the work like these paintings can really encourage people. So that's it for now. We're going to have one more video tomorrow. It'll be our last video. We're going to talk about modernism and postmodernism, and then we're going to move on. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope this gave you a few insights into the American art scene.